I'm sorry, but what did ska music ever do to deserve this kind of treatment? Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2023 horror comedy, Renfield. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all that extra content. Renfield stars Nicolas Hoult, Nicolas Cage, and Awkwafina, and was directed by McKay. It tells the story of Dracula's servant and familiar, Renfield, as he begins to question his future and the toxic nature of his relationship with Dracula. After a couple failed attempts at making the dark universe a thing, Universal has smartly shifted their approach for bringing their classic horror IPs back to the big screen. Renfield is a Dracula movie, but it's unlike any Dracula movie we've had before, for a number of different reasons. First and foremost is the focus. Rather than telling a Dracula origin story or a typical stalk and feast tale, this film sticks Dracula in a supporting role, instead focusing on his servant and familiar, Renfield. Although this version of Renfield is a new take on the character, he's been around since the beginning, dating all the way back to the novel, and has appeared in various forms in many Dracula and Dracula-inspired movies over the years. But centering the story on him was an interesting and unique decision, as was making the story a horror comedy, rather than taking the more serious-toned approach of most Dracula films of the past. These changes in approach certainly held some fun promise. By situating the story in modern day and framing it as a tale of Renfield realizing he's in a toxic codependent relationship with Dracula, it seemed as though it would be able to take the Dracula legend and turn it into a relatable comedy. And it sort of succeeds at that. When the story focuses on Renfield and Dracula's relationship, it's pretty fun. But despite the seeming expansiveness of this unique premise, it somehow ends up feeling stretched thin. In addition to the codependent relationship and Dracula's world domination plan, there's a whole other half of the story thrown in that centers around the human characters. We've got police corruption, a crime family that runs New Orleans, and a multitude of subplots surrounding Awkwafina's character, Rebecca. None of the story beats and plot lines are bad, but it's a little too much for a film that could have used a lot more Dracula. Needless to say, Dracula is among the highlights of this film, and that's almost entirely due to Nicolas Cage's performance. He absolutely chews things up in this role, and it's clear that he had a blast making this film. This version of Dracula is very much a Nick Cage kind of role. Over the top, uniquely funny, more than a little bit unhinged. It's exactly what you'd expect to see from Nicolas Cage playing Dracula. The same thing can be said about all the other performances too. They're all fine, though never quite reaching Cage levels, but they also all deliver exactly what you expect from them. Nicolas Hoult plays the quirky but sweet pale weirdo, Awkwafina is brash and overly jokey, Schwartz is loud and obnoxious. Nobody goes out of their comfort zone or typecasting, but nobody really needs to either. Instead, they just give you a lot of what you expect, for better or worse. One thing I certainly did not expect, however, was just how bloody and gory this movie is. It's almost all presented in an extremely campy, over-the-top way, so we're not talking gore that'll make you queasy or anything, but it was still a lot more than I would have guessed based on the marketing. This has gallons and gallons of CG blood, but also has a lot of practical effects too. The progressive makeup of Dracula as he heals over the course of the film is occasionally gruesome, and there were just a lot of really creative kills, including punch decapitation, humorous impalement, and someone having their face literally ripped off. This Dracula film is far from scary and rarely has any tension at all, but as an over-the-top, extremely campy B-horror movie-inspired comedy, it gets the job done. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one is Nicolas Cage. Dracula is one of those characters he's long expressed a desire to play, and his enthusiasm for it really shows. This is definitely a different version of Dracula than we've ever seen before, but it very much works for this campy B-movie horror comedy. This is an extremely Nick Cage kind of role, and he delivers exactly the kind of chaotic, all-in performance you'd expect him to. He really leans into his Nick Cage persona here, so it's frequently Dracula doing a showcase of Nicolas Cage mannerisms, but if you like those iconic Cageisms, you're gonna have as much of a blast watching him as he clearly had performing. The second pro is the makeup. Despite the subject, I somehow was not expecting this movie to be anywhere near as bloody and gory as it actually is. It's supremely campy and self-aware, and there's an awful lot of CG blood, but the elements that are practical were surprisingly good. The most impressive aspect of this was Dracula's makeup. Throughout the film, he's gradually healing and regaining his powers, so we see him in various stages of flesh regrowth. It's actually surprisingly gruesome looking at times, which is an interesting combination with the goofy, campy visuals of the rest of the film. On the con side, the biggest issue is the script. The premise here, focusing on Dracula's servant and their toxic codependent relationship, certainly held a lot of comedic potential, but the way it's actually utilized is a tad underwhelming. It's an idea that's stretched very thin, so in an effort to get the runtime up to about 90 minutes, a whole secondary plotline about crime families and police corruption was thrown in. It sorta works, but neither storyline has a satisfying amount of time devoted to it, so it ends up feeling overstuffed yet underwhelming at the same time. The second con is the editing. This film is a very campy horror comedy, so the argument could probably be made that at least some of the editing oddities were intentional, but at times it almost felt like they had accidentally released an early cut of this film. There are broader pacing issues, and the action scenes are plagued by frustrating, quick-cut shaky cam, but there are other editing issues that just seem amateurish or accidental. One editing transition in which Awkwafina's character is being helped down from the second story of an apartment building really stands out, but there were a lot of bizarre continuity errors and choppiness throughout. It seems like scenes were probably removed, but the work was never done afterwards to smooth things out and try to hide the fact that scenes had been cut. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Renfield or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Renfield 3 out of 5 paws. It's a film that has some script and editing issues, but it still manages to mostly deliver on its promise of campy fun with a unique premise, an over-the-top Nicolas Cage performance, and a surprising amount of blood and gore. I would recommend Renfield to fans of horror comedies, especially those who enjoy the campiness of B-horror. The story isn't as interesting as it could have been, but the fun premise and key performances are sure to please. That, combined with gallons of blood and unique over-the-top kills, will certainly satisfy any camp cravings you might have. If you don't like the typical Nicolas Cage, Awkwafina, or Ben Schwartz performances, this might be slightly less enjoyable to you, because all three of them do their usual kind of thing here. And if you're looking for actual scares or horror, you'll want to find some other vampire fare. This is very bloody, but the tension and scares are non-existent. It's just a comedy that's been dunked in blood. If you liked Renfield, I would recommend the 1931 Dracula. Probably a super obvious recommendation, but this classic Universal Monsters telling of the Dracula story does a good job of balancing a few different genres, and is obviously a good introduction to the characters of Dracula and Renfield. Plus, certain black and white scenes early on in Renfield are fun references to this film. If you're looking for another horror comedy with a romantic subplot, you should watch Warm Bodies. It features Nicolas Hoult in another exceptionally pale but sweet role as a zombie who gradually falls in love with a human. And if you want another recent over-the-top campy horror comedy, you might want to check out Studio 666. It's another film with an admittedly weak script, but has some literally killer practical effects and is a fun one for fans of the Foo Fighters. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Renfield? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite vampire movie? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.